So, brothers and sisters, it's 2 years since we last looked at the signs of the times and how much has happened in that time period. It's been an incredible 2 years with Brexit taking place and changes in Israel and all around the world. Wherever we look, we are reassured that things are happening according to the plan. Well, we haven't got a lot of time, so what I'm going to concentrate on are many things that have happened since the last milestones came out in February. And we're going to look at 3 areas, really. I've put 4 down there, but I've had to scrub out Europe and Russia because there's so much in the others, and there'll just be one slide on Europe. So we're going to start by looking at pandemics, then looking at Britain, and then we'll be looking at Israel and the Middle East. So, milestones, if you haven't had a copy, there's some in the bookstore. That looks at the events of 2020. Things that I would have talked about if there had been a Brecon last year. So, let's move on. I don't know, that's it. So, there is an interesting passage which was mentioned in the closing prayer from Isaiah, that Isaiah talks about a calling for God's people to come out, come ye my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy door about thee. Hide thyself, as it were, for a moment, until the indignation be overpast. For behold, Yahweh cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And we believe we're in this period where God is punishing the nations for their iniquity and preparing them so that they come down against Israel to conquer the land, to destroy them as a nation, in order that Christ and the saints can come up to save them. So it's indicating that for the saints, and maybe for Israel, not all the troubles that are going to be poured out upon the world we will see. We're going to be called away so that we don't see the last dramatic phases of God's judgments. And what I'm going to propose is there is a very strong parallel between the plagues of Egypt and God's coming judgments. They both had the same outcome. The Lord Jesus coming back to cause Israel to be his people, to restore them to the promised land and to inherit their inheritance. And this is what the plagues in Egypt were about. And God, before ever the first plague came, set out an outline of what was going to be achieved in these times of trouble. And he told Moses that Pharaoh wasn't going to listen, and I'm going to stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof. And after that he will let you go. I'm going to give you people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. They shall not let you go empty, but you will borrow of your neighbour, and her that sotteneth in her house, jewels of silver, jewels of gold, raiment. And ye shall put them upon your sons and your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. Now, that seemed an impossibility. There they were as slaves. And yet here was God, through Moses, who had suddenly reappeared in their midst, telling them that God was going to spoil this mighty power, the mightiest power of the earth at that time, the Egyptian nation. And we can see that there are these strong parallels between the judgments upon the nations of today, who are seeking to destroy. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. They hate Israel and what Israel stands for. We can see that there are these parallels. And just as with Egypt, wave after wave of plague was brought upon Egypt until finally Pharaoh's power was broken and they were let go. And again, God sets out, before anything happens, this wonderful chiasm. I am Yahweh. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rid you out of their bondage. I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. And the centre one, and I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God. So that's what it was all hinging about. God taking Israel as his people, and they recognising Yahweh as their God. And ye shall know that I am Yahweh your God, which bringeth you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you into the land, concerning which I did swear to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it you for an heritage. I am Yahweh. So this 7-point promise of God was set out before anything happened, and all those details came exactly to pass as God had promised. So the 10 plagues, we know from Sunday school, various plagues that were poured out upon them. But I just want to pick out 2 important features. One, both Egypt and Israel were affected by the first 3 plagues. The last 7, Israel weren't affected at all. It only affected the Egyptians. So to begin with, Israel had to suffer. They had to learn, they had to listen to God. He had come to save them, and they suffered the first 3 plagues. And thereafter, they were free from any of those plagues. And the other thing to notice is that the magicians, they were able to copy the first 2 plagues, to turn blood into water. Water into blood. Wasn't too difficult for them. And to produce frogs, I expect with sleight of hand, they were able to convince Pharaoh that they could do this kind of thing. But when it got to the 3rd plague, they gave up and said, this is the finger of God. This is outside anything that we magicians can do. And we know how the judgments were upon the different gods of Egypt, which they worshipped, showing the powerlessness of Egypt's God compared with the powerfulness of Israel's God. Until finally Pharaoh himself, who was the chief god, he too was struck. He lost his firstborn son. And that was the end. He gave in, he let the people go. And then outside those plagues, but part of it, at the Red Sea crossing, the whole of the military might of Egypt was destroyed. And so, brothers and sisters, I think that we shall see 3 outpourings of judgment. Now, whether COVID is the first one, we can't be sure. It could be that the financial crisis from 2007 to 2017 was the first pandemic. It's something that affected virtually all nations. And man with his skills managed to overcome the problems and put things back on a more or less even keel. And so maybe COVID is number 2. We can't be sure. We'll only in hindsight be able to know. And again, man with his skills has found vaccines that we can meet here. And although the problems are still there, the burdens have been lifted quite considerably by the skills of the magicians of this world. The 3rd might be this tremendous upset in the weather, with fires and floods and earthquakes and all sorts of strange things, heat and cold, in all extremities. This might be the 3rd wave of God's judgments, because they seem to be appearing in America, in Europe, in Israel, got bad fires in Jerusalem, over into Asia. All parts have been affected. And of course, man is then powerless to do anything. He can try and put the fires out, but he can't stop earthquakes, he can't stop floods. I know a lot of these things are because of man's mismanagement of nature, but the goodness has been taken out of the soil because of man's greed, and therefore the water runs through quickly into the rivers and causes flooding, and building houses in floodplains and then being surprised when they get flooded. But I think behind these things there seems to be so much happening that seems to indicate, well, this is another of the outpourings of God's judgments. And so there are, if that is true, another 7 more to follow. But as this passage in Isaiah 26 indicates, as Brother Jerry said in his prayer, this is what we look for. We're going to be taken out of this world. We're going to be taken to Sinai to judgment. And while we're there, and I believe the judgment seat occupies probably 10 years, and with all the things involved with it, until Go comes down against Israel. During that time, God will be sending his judgments one upon another, upon another, upon another, so that men's hearts will be failing and fulfilled for all the things that are happening. But we've been reassured that we'll be taken out of it, we'll be spared the rest of those judgments. So what has been happening has been a wake-up call, like it was to Israel, to make us realise that we are very close to the coming of the Lord Jesus. I'm going to wait to see Go come down. No, long before then, we'll be called away and the dead will be raised and taken to Sinai. So let's have a look at Britain. And you've seen this chart. I've been using it ever since the referendum, 2016. And now we're much closer. It is from Isaiah chapter 23, which tells us that in verse 15, that it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre, and we believe that Britain is the latter-day Tyre, shall be forgotten 70 years according to the days of one king. And after the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as an harlot and trade with all nations of the world. And we have this remarkable fact, brothers and sisters, that here we are in the 70th year of the Queen of this country. Elizabeth is the longest lived and longest reigning British monarch, the longest serving female head of state in world history, the world's oldest living monarch, the longest reigning current monarch, and the oldest and longest serving current head of state. So this is a remarkable thing. We can see Britain coming out of a period of being forgotten and turning now to look at world trade. And here we are at the end of 70 years as the years of a king. So if we date the 70 years from the first real duties that Queen Philip undertook before she became Queen, when she went to Canada and the United States in October 51, then the 70 years expire in a couple of months' time. If we date it from when she became Queen, then February 2022. So again, not very long. Prince Philip has passed off the scene, but the Queen seems very agile still and has restarted her duties. In the mercy of God, we shall see her come to the end of her 70 years. And I can see that we're not out of the woods yet. We, in Britain, as soon as the EU come back from their summer holidays, there's going to be an almighty battle over Northern Ireland. And I can see it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the agreement which Britain made will get torn up and Britain will be totally free of the EU. We know how the EU is so intent on having Britain still under her clutches, and she's doing everything she can to avoid having Britain as an independent competitor. That's what they cannot abide, that thought. So they're making things as difficult as possible. I think the time is coming. We know that Britain has to be totally free of the EU that this is about to blow up in the next few months. And so separating from Europe has proved to be a difficult pathway. It's 5 years since the referendum, and as I say, things are very difficult. So what we are seeing is that Britain has a role outside Europe. I'm not going to go into any detail of Nebuchadnezzar's image, but we know how that is looking at Europe and Russia. 2 legs. We're now in the feet stage, the forming of the feet. I believe the Russian foot was formed when communism fell. Very rapidly, church and state worked together. Ironclad, church and the people, democracy working together. What we're beginning to see, now Britain is on the way out of Europe, is this drive in Europe to unify. And the Pope is working very hard, promoting Robert Schumann as the Pope for Europe, promoting him to sainthood. There was a bit of this in the paper yesterday. They've moved on another step. I haven't had time to even read the article, but things are moving on that side. But Britain isn't part of that. It's not part of the legs, or the Western leg of the image. She has an independent role to play. We know from Ezekiel chapter 38, she's part of this grouping of nations that are opposed to the invasion of Gog of Israel. Sheba and Dedan we associate with the Gulf states, the very region that so much is going on now with the Abraham Accords. It's fascinating how that has sprung to life. And Britain is the old line, and with her the young lines, the Commonwealth countries. And again, Britain is so closely involved in Israel now and in the Middle East, as are the Commonwealth countries. That is one of their big focuses. Israel, trade with Israel, trade with the Middle East. So it's so fascinating to see that in just the past few years, things are being transformed in the Middle East. But we'll look at that when we come to look at Israel. So the stumbling block at the moment is this Northern Ireland Protocol and the border checks that are imposed when any goods go from Britain to the EU. Battle over the financial services, battle over Gibraltar, battle over the divorce bill. There's a whole thing, lot of things piling up, just waiting for the holidays to end when it can all blow up. So the protocol, when Britain was part of the EU, of course there was no problems. Goods can flow from Northern Ireland to Southern Ireland because they were both in the EU. Once Britain and Northern Ireland are out of the EU, then there needs to be some border checks for goods going from Northern Ireland to Southern Ireland. And in the past, before Britain and Northern Ireland joined the EU, of course there was a border in Northern Ireland separating it from Southern Ireland. And this was a matter of great conflict. And the EU is determined that they're not going to have border controls separating the two. What they want is to absorb Northern Ireland into Southern Ireland and have a united Ireland. Britain is intent on keeping Northern Ireland part of the UK. And so, with all the discussions that took place, the compromise was that there would be a division put between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, and the checks would be made there. Now, the EU have chosen to be as difficult as they possibly can at the implementation of those crossing border checks. And they have made it as hard as possible, which of course has made it very difficult for Britain and for trade. And just a few weeks ago, the head of Marks and Spencer's gave a report of how difficult it is for them to move goods from mainland Britain into Northern Ireland to go into the Marks and Spencers in Northern Ireland. They're not going to go into Southern Ireland, no intention of doing that because they haven't got stores there. But the paperwork, every wagon that goes, especially if they're meat products, they have to have vet's certificates for the meat and the butter and the bread and everything. And so he says that every wagon that we send typically has about 8 documents, 720 pages per truck. That's 3 large books. It's about 40,000 pages a week just for them to ship stuff into Northern Ireland. To do that, we're employing 13 full-time vets. They're not looking after animals or welfare. They're simply ticking boxes and filling out the forms. And for a lot of goods, because the agreement was we put the border there, and although the Northern Ireland is still part of the UK, the other side of the bargain was, well, we will regard Northern Ireland as if it was in the EU, so that if you want to send any goods to the EU, then they've got to be approved by the EU. Now, there are a lot of medicines and that kind of thing, which it's just not worth the cost of getting the CE mark for approval. And so it is causing a lot of problems in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of unrest because shelves are being emptied. And it's led to the DUP, who are a Protestant party there. Arlene Foster had to resign. The replacement only lasted another month before he resigned. And there's great fears of the troubles re-arising because the problems in Northern Ireland. And so David Frost, the UK negotiators, issued an ultimatum to the EU saying, we're going to change the rules. And they're allowed to do that because in the negotiations, they were wise enough to put a little proviso to say, if things don't work out, then there's an Article 16 which we can trigger, which puts us back and we have to renegotiate. And that is where they are at the moment. They have said to the EU, we're going to renegotiate, these rules aren't working, we're not obeying the spirit of the thing, and there's great troubles ahead. The EU on their part are saying, no, you signed up, you've got to stick to it. And they've issued their ultimatum back to Britain, saying that their patience is wearing thin. But as I say, they're all on holiday, so nothing is happening at the moment. And because they regard Northern Ireland as part of the EU, we've had this bizarre situation that the EU have said to Britain, well, here 800 new regulations that we've passed which apply to the EU, you've got to apply them to Northern Ireland. And there was no notice, and of course Britain hadn't been involved in them. So as I say, on every twist and turn, the EU has done its best to cause friction, to show its displeasure at Britain leaving their sacred EU. And the border checks into the rest of Europe have been very stringent. If they find in the driver's cab a sandwich which doesn't have the right paperwork, and a sandwich on its own would involve about 8 or 9 pages of different paperwork, then the whole lorry is confiscated. It's not allowed to go anywhere until they get that sorted out. And very often by the time that's sorted out, the load's perished if it's perishable stuff. So as I say, they've gone out of the way to make silly objections and not allow things to go smoothly. So they force this upon Britain. And of course we see the hand of God. We know Britain's not going to be part of Europe. So they're forcing the pace, as it were. Financial services, again, they haven't made it easy. They haven't given Britain the ability to carry on with dealing with financial services. They're saying if you're going to deal with financial services, you've got to have a branch in the EU. You can't deal with it from London. So again, that's caused a lot of problems. And Britain is saying, do we need the EU? There's the world out there. If we scrap all the regulations that the EU insists and don't bother with the EU, with a much lighter touch, we can go out to the world and do much more business with people who want to deal with us, not people who are making it as awkward as possible. Gibraltar. The agreements that were signed in December was that Eurocorps, which is the EU police force, would police the border between Spain and Gibraltar, and Britain agreed to that. And then in July, Spain says, no, we don't want Eurocorps, we're going to deal with it ourselves. And of course there's been historic trouble between the Spanish and the Gibraltarians. So again, another sign of making life difficult, quite unnecessary. And the EU is quite happy to break the agreement that was made when it suits them, but not when it's the other way around. The divorce bill, suddenly the divorce bill has shot up. It's a staggering £40 billion for the privilege of leaving, and number 10 says we're not going to pay that amount. And of course, if Britain does finally break from the agreement that was made, then I assume they won't have to pay the divorce bill. So there is a little bit of pressure on the part of the EU to try and keep Britain held in, because £40 billion is not to be sneezed at. Interestingly, to Britain's trade with the EU, her imports from the EU are declining, and they are increasing with the rest of the world, which is what we expect. And again, this was an interesting headline last week that Boris is being told, look, forget the EU, it's not worth the bother. Go to the world, and especially focus on Kanzak. So that's Canada, New Zealand, Australia, we go to the ANU, and the UK. So the old line and 3 of the Commonwealth countries are very keen to come together and form an alliance, form a trade agreement, in order to be a power that will be in opposition to the EU. And we've seen how in the past few months Britain has been projecting her power. 2 months ago, that's the next slide. Britain is still the world's second naval power. It depends how you look at the figures, but you can make a good case that Britain still is number 2 as far as naval power is concerned. And 2 months ago, the carrier strike force set out to travel halfway around the world. At the centre of it, the new Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, and help from America and Denmark with ships and aeroplanes, and they're on a route which has taken them. Some of them went up into the Black Sea and had a little complication with the Russians. Some visited Israel. They've all gone through the Suez Canal. They've been to Oman. They had exercises with India. They've gone to Singapore, and now they're somewhere. And strangely, I Googled and Googled. I can't find out exactly where they are, but they're on their way to Taiwan and Japan. So, visiting over 40 countries as a show of strength. One of the ships went to Israel, and there are very good relations now between Israel and the UK. Still differences of opinion over things, but things have moved a long way forward in the past few years. And Britain is now going to permanently deploy 2 ships in Asia, as well as one of the aircraft carrier to be permanently east of Suez. So, very interesting things here. And as far as trade agreements are concerned, Liz Truss is working on one with Israel. This is back in July. Of course, it's a new government there. They've got a lot of things on their plate. but they're hoping within the next few months to sign up a £5 million trade deal with Israel. They've already got a rollover one, so they trade as if they were still in the EU, but this is a much more complex one. And the Australian one has now been signed, and that was followed by an interesting policy document saying how Britain and Australia can work together to the defence of the area around there because of the aggression of China. Still working on the New Zealand one, and again in this morning's paper, they're hoping within about a couple of months that will all be tied up. New Zealand is very keen to have a really good trade agreement with Britain, which will open up a lot more trade. So nearly there, but not quite. Working on India, they've had a provisional agreement early in the year, and now enlarging that, and that will be a 23 billion trade deal when that gets into being. But the ultimate goal is the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are a series of countries around the Pacific Rim, and Britain wants to be part of that, and they're all keen to have Britain there, and that will open up huge markets. And then the final one there is an interesting one with a dealing. She's made an agreement with the UAE, a $2 billion deal was signed in February time, but Britain now is looking at the Gulf states, a series of 6 Gulf states, and forming a trade agreement with them. And again, we can see that in these last times, this is God's hand. They're part of this opposition to the invasion of Israel, working with Sheba and Dedan, these nations of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, they're very wealthy. Very keen to invest in Britain, which is now not tied to all the rules and regulations of the EU, but is free to do trade as they want. And it is forecast that the economy this year in the UK will grow at 7.4%. That's the fastest since 1941, so absolutely staggering. And mergers and acquisitions is an area which brings wealth to this country. And again, it was said that if Britain left the EU, then they would lose all that trade. Like all the scare stories, that is not the case. These are going, lots of countries wanting to invest. And finally, for Britain, it's very interesting. Batteries need lithium, and lithium is found in Britain, in Cornwall, in mines. And just yesterday was a report that the lithium that they have found in the water, deep down in the Earth's surface, has the highest concentration of lithium of anywhere in the world. So again, you can see how God is positioning things for the benefit of Britain so that she can prosper in this important area of batteries, which have an important role to play. So, as I say, I'm just one slide about Europe, really, and that's to watch the German elections. The other thing is that Biden and Merkel have done a deal so that the Nord Stream can go ahead. Under Trump, there were a lot of obstacles put, but now those have been lifted so that Russia can finish off the pipeline, and this draws Europe and Russia closer together. We know they have two legs of one image. And so again, here's another step in the right direction as far as we're concerned. But Laschet is expected to win the German elections. He is a very devout Roman Catholic, great believer in Charlemagne. He was the one that put forward the Pope as the winner of the Charlemagne Prize, was it 2016, 17? If he becomes president, then chancellor, I should say, then we should expect to see Germany and Europe working to bind together with the Roman Catholic Church, working with Europe in a similar way to what is happening, church and state in Russia. And that will then make the forming of the Western leg a real reality. So watch the elections. We've only got another month to go, just over a month before those elections. So let's look at Israel. So we now finally have got a new government. Normally governments have been right-wing. This one is very much left-wing. We never had so many coalition partners coming together to form a government. But it has set out a new hope for Israel. Under Netanyahu, there was an economic miracle. Many amazing things happened under his rulership. But one of the things he wasn't good at was reaching out to the Arab population in Israel. And if there is to be a time of peace, which we know there has to be because that's what the scriptures tell us, then there has to be a deeper reconciliation between Jew and Arab in Israel. And this government is intent on doing that. There is, for the first time in an Israeli government, there is an Arab party is part of the coalition. And they have managed to come together, broad mix of parties. Bennett is the first religious leader that Israel has had. Netanyahu had Bible classes and that, but he wouldn't be described as a religious leader. But Bennett is the first religious leader. And so the first time got Arabs in the government. It is a wafer-thin coalition, but they seem to have held so far and seem to have handled the Hamas war very well. What was new this time was the extensive use of drones by the Israeli military so that they were able to see in real time what was happening in Gaza, so that very quickly they could direct the fire against where missiles were being launched. And it meant they didn't have to involve personnel. Soldiers didn't have to go into Gaza. They used the drones to get the information they needed. So that worked. And they are reaching out to the Arab world. And so for the first time, Israel, well, it hasn't yet got a budget, but the budget has been put forward, which is being discussed by the Knesset at the moment. And part of that is a transformation of a lot of money, $9 billion, for the Arab sector. So they're reaching out to try and bring the Arabs on board. Because where Arabs and Israelis work together, they prosper. The problem is obviously Fatah and Hamas. And I think they're hoping that the peoples will rise up against their leaders and get rid of them and replace them by people who are prepared to work with Israel rather than against them. Interestingly, the Abraham Accords stood the test of the Hamas war. In times past, that would have been no for the Arabs. They would have protested at what Israel was doing. It was very muted, and it hasn't affected the Abraham Accords. In fact, of course, the UAE was the first to sign. The trade is increasing rapidly. They're expecting in the full year of 2021 to have $1 billion trade between the two. I'm expecting to reach $3 billion within 3 years. There's a real thirst to partner with Israel. Israel has so many technologies which they desperately need, and Israel needs their involvement with investment. And so there seems to be a working partnership, a whole different attitude compared with the old treaties with Egypt and with Jordan. And there was just an account on last Thursday, Abraham Accords 1 year later shaping a common future, just showing how well it's working. But what was interesting is, for August the 10th, Egypt and Israel discussed natural gas cooperation. So what had been a cold peace between the two countries is now becoming a very live peace. And Egypt is taking a lot of Israeli gas, and they're working on how they can boost things. So again, that's showing a change in the region, because Egypt is one of the countries that's on the side of Israel, gets taken when go comes, and takes Israel and Egypt. But we know that beforehand, she's working with Israel. Israel is nearly finished building this huge port, a new port at Haifa. Haifa is the main port they have. They built a brand new, state-of-the-art, very efficient handling, reducing cost port at Haifa, which is opening at the beginning of next month. And because of the increase in the amount of gas that Egypt wants, the owners of the Leviathan field are having to bring forward the drilling of extra wells. There's about 4 wells have already been drilled. There's a lot more planned. It's a very big area. But because of this increase in demand, then they have pulled forward the drilling of the new wells in order to be able to supply the needs of Egypt. So, brothers and sisters, we've been in a very interesting time period. On all sorts of fields, things are moving step by step forward. And we have to rejoice. And we have to take lessons from what we see. We see God's judgments and COVID and Brexit. We see Middle East peace. We see a rise in the nations roaring, the sea and the waves roaring, anarchy, people power, opposed to the clampdown on movement that COVID has brought. All these are signs which have been given to us. We see Britain powering away from the EU. So we have to look at these signs, brothers and sisters, and respond to them. We have to appreciate that these are things which God in his mercy has given us as signs so that we can wake up, because the call to the Master is very imminent. And in that day, we won't be able to say, "You didn't warn us you were coming." He's given us ample warning that his coming is very close. So the things that we see happening around, which the world thinks are just chance, random things, and climate and all the rest of it, these are things which are in God's hands, as signs to us that herald the return of the Lord Jesus. And so we watch, brothers and sisters. We lift up our heads. We rejoice. We happen to be in that generation which, God willing, will see the coming of the Lord Jesus. We'll be among those who are alive to be caught away to the judgment seat. So I've just put on my last apostolic. Obviously, Milestones looks at the affairs of the previous year. In the Bible magazine, I do updates every quarter, so that's a bit more up to date. And then those of you who are brave enough to do a lot of reading, about every 2 or 3 days, I send out about 16 pages of the articles which I come across, which I feel are relevant, which I use when I'm doing Milestones in the Bible magazine update. And if you want those, then just send me an email to don@milestonesuk.org, and I'll put you on the mailing list. So, brothers and sisters, thank you for your patience, and we've actually